The book was written with Professor Mariluz Vallejo, which is a professor at the Department of Communication and Languages from Javeriana University in Colombia. We have two very special guests today. Firstly, and many thanks to the Colombian ambassador Nestor Osorio Londoño, which is ambassador to the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland since February 2014. Prior to his arrival in London, between November 2010 and January 2014, Ambassador Osorio was a permanent representative of Colombia to the United Nations in New York. In January 2013, he was elected President of the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations. For a year term, during his time in the United Nations, Ambassador Osorio represented Colombia in the Security Council and held the Council's presidency in April 2011 and July 2012. He's doctor in law, doctor in administrative law, and has been professor of constitutional and public law as well as economics. So thank you very much, Ambassador, for accepting our invitation today. Also, we have Dr. Stephen McLoughlin, who's the director of the Master's Degree in Peace Studies and Deputy Director of the Archbishop Desmond Tutu Center for War and Peace Studies. So, let me just make a brief presentation of the work before we move on to discuss the challenges of the peace implementation in Colombia. And let me start by giving you some context about Colombian conflict and the law of victims and land restitution, then move on a little bit to what we did, so a little bit about our work, and then 4 contributions that we think would be done through this research. Firstly, some context about the law of victims and land restitution. According to the Commission of Historical Memory, between 1958 and 2012, 218,094 people were killed in the context of the armed conflict, 81% of which were civilians. 5.7 million people were displaced and 8.3 million hectares of land were stolen. The dynamics of the armed conflict in Colombia are complex, are multi-layered. They involved right-wing paramilitaries, they involve drug lords, they involve left-wing guerrilla groups, the state, of course, and economic and other social groups. So the law of victims and land restitution was ratified in June 2011. It came to force in 2012 and it's been implemented for a period of 10 years. The law has as its core redressing the victims of the armed conflict, and particularly allowed through that redress into putting the victims at the core of the possibilities of the resolution of the armed conflict, the path so that the country can do the transit to a post-conflict situation. In addition to this, the government also started its talks with the guerrilla groups, left-wing guerrilla groups in the country, first with FARC, which is the biggest one, and we carried out this process between 2012 and 2016. The implementation of that agreement started in 2017. And also in February 2017, the government started formally negotiations with the second biggest left-wing guerrilla group in the country, which is the ELN. According to the report of the Unit of Land Restitution, there has been 109,136 requests for restitution so far, so by October 2017, by 75,179 title holders. And so far, there are 30,220 beneficiaries of people whose land has been restituted up till October 2017. The question we're asking, and I suppose in the context of lots of research, political commentary and so on, that departs from jurisprudence analysis, economic analysis, political analysis, our question was somehow different. We were asking how political sectors and journalists promoted politically motivated and rhetorically charged accounts about the law. And we have a fancy term for that. We call that rhetorical frames. And we're doing this because we want to understand the role of political and media debates in building or undermining consensus and public support for the law of victims and restitution. So in order to do this, we analyzed about 600 public official communications by the main stakeholders that were debating publicly the law in Colombia. And also we did an analysis of 1,500 news articles of 7 national and regional newspapers, and those newspapers belonging to areas that were prioritized for the implementation of the law. So we chose to analyze a period that is a very important period for the consolidation of the law of victims and restitution and the peace process we tried between 2012 to 2016. But also we choose newspapers in particular because newspapers are a key place for the influence of political opinion in the country, but also a very important place to understand the articulation of a strategic communication by key stakeholders. Regional news media belong to economic and political powerhouses, and the national newspaper belong to economic groups. So this makes it a very, very important place in which to articulate what is happening with that public and political debate. And we look at those debates in relation to their implications of how people were debating the law, in relation to rural development, human rights, peace building in Colombia, the peace process that were ongoing in Colombia, the dynamics of the armed conflict, and so on. Let me point out 4 contributions of that work. First contribution has to do with understanding similarities and differences and nuances in the ways in which different regions are discussing restitution in the country. So we find similarities such as, for instance, all the newspapers in all the regions privilege institutional processes of promotion and implementation of the law and dynamics of armed conflict attached to it. But there are different degrees of attention that key regions in which the law is being implemented are paying attention that is being paid by newspapers in Colombia. So the level of coverage varies, but also the level of support that the government gets also varies in different regions, which is quite interesting. And the quality of the debate in terms of being supported by fallacies or by rhetorical figures, and what I mean by fallacies is faulty reasonings using to achieve support by distorting the truth, but also rhetorical figures, and what I mean by that is use of language in a non-literal, unusual way to convey meanings and emotions. So we look at the ways in which different news media and different political actors are using rhetorics to achieve a greater degree of persuasion. Our contribution number 2 is that we identify that some issues, so when the law is discussed in relation to, for instance, institutional implementation or rural development, the government tends to be placed in a better footing than when the law is being discussed in relation to human rights or the peace process in Colombia. And this is very interesting because it leads us to understand from a different angle deep-rooted conflicts that are pervasive and remain as a challenge in terms of achieving peace in the country. So to give you an example of this, the government, when the law was being discussed in relation to formalizing land titles or promoting alliances between big capital and small capital, so to promote development, the government had an easier time with elite sectors in Colombia and with the media than when the government was promoted human rights and restitution. Because although the law doesn't really discriminate amongst victims, still there are political sectors in the country that are defending that the status of the victims, the real victims, are the rural poor, and they are victims of economic and political corrupt elites that are making alliances with right-wing paramilitaries. And there is another sector that is defending, that is owners in good faith, and honest businessmen in the countryside who are the victims not only of restitution that is putting them and making them look bad in public, in front of the public, and stigmatizing them, but also they are actually the true victims of left-wing guerrilla groups. And these two camps are fighting very strongly for their status in front of the law. And so this is the second contribution we hope to make. The third contribution has to do with the quality of political and media debates. And we find that there is a very little distance that is taken by newspapers in Colombia against fallacies that are pervasive in the political discourse. And in fact, and more worryingly still, we find a statistically significant correlation between the amount of fallacies that political actors are using and the media attention they're getting. And this is very worrying in an environment of, and I think that contributes of all this discussion about the post-truth environments that are so kind of in fashion right now. So this research is proving that the more political actors packed the discourses and the frames with fallacies, the more media attention they got. And also we distinguish between which fallacies were being used in support of the government and which fallacies and rhetorical figures were used in opposition to the government or alternative to what the government was saying, which contributes greatly into looking at the quality of the debate of land restitution in the country. The last contribution I want to talk about is how studying the quality of political and media debate in the country gives us some keys as to understand the challenges also the government had to face in promoting peace agreements in the view of the referendum of 2016, but also gives us keys to the kind of political struggle it has to give in the face of the forthcoming presidential elections in 2018. Because the sectors that were more radically opposed to transitional justice in Colombia, in particular land restitution, were the sectors that were struggling using the same arguments, recycling the same arguments against the peace process with FARC. And so studying the law gives us a key into these challenges. And when you look at that structurally, the last report of the Ombudsman Office in 2017 is showing how recent waves of killings of human rights defenders in Colombia had two explanations or two important factors. One is illegal actors trying to take over areas that have been left by the mobilized guerrilla groups. But the second one has to do with, and this is according to the report of the Ombudsman Office, regional elites opposing peace agreement and reforms included, particularly over return, land restitution, and victims' redress, and in association with illegal actors, they're promoting stigmatization, sometimes threats, and sometimes direct violence against people and organizations that are championing peace in the regions and that are championing restitution and victims' rights. So I'll stop here and only summarize by saying that then the four contributions that we've been trying to put forward are identifying those regional nuances in terms of the discussion of the law, because at the end of the day, its implementation is territorial. The discussion of the law in relation to different issues that are contentious and explaining to a great deal the features of the Colombian conflict. The quality of the debate in terms of how the rhetorical fallacies and figures are actually used to support the different sectors that are the different stakeholders in restitution, and finally how the study really of restitution and land restitution can give us keys to the type of debate and the type of challenges the government is facing in its attempts to bring peace to the country. So let me just stop here. I'm now going to welcome Ambassador Nestor Osorio Londoño to talk about those challenges in peace implementation. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Very well. Let me, first of all, thank you, Catalina, and thank you all the authorities of the Liverpool Hope University, for having me today here, and to allow me to share with you some of the reflections and issues that have been around the peace process in Colombia. Let me give you, first of all, a little bit of a historical perspective, because it is very easy to hear about the guerrillas, the confrontation, the social inequalities, but where all this come from? Colombia is a country 200 years old of independence that has been struggling for many, many years in terms of creating all the sources of social and economic development. And of course, like all Latin American countries, the exercise of politics and the differences about how to conceive our states have been present all around our history. And in this history, it is clear that the different ideologies have been present to try to see what is the direction of the country. And there have been mainly two big currents in terms of political approach: the Liberal Party, the Conservative Party, which is part of the classics and traditions of many countries about what we can call the right or the left. With time, the difference between these parties have been diluted, but the fact is, to bring things back in front to our realities, is that in the first part of the last century, going to the 50s, there was a big confrontation between the two parties, a confrontation that even went to a very violent period. And in the middle of all this was a crucial problem: the inequality of the country and the land distribution. And this is something that should be a common issue for you to analyze, how in many Latin American countries, one of the characteristics of the social problems have been the ownership of the land, the big inequality, and the social differences. And at the end of the 50s, we managed to create a kind of consensus that would allow the country to come back to some peace atmosphere. And it's in this context that the remainings of the hatreds and the different problems that existed between the society were capitalized by the wave of the times, what was the revolution, the Cuban Revolution. We are talking about the late 50s, the early 60s. Castro comes to Cuba, takes power, starts with a new approach to life, and the mission of the Cuban Revolution was to expand and to have in all Latin America a similar revolutionary approach. And it's in this context that the remainings of the previous violence between the two parties generates the existence of this guerrilla as a very well characterized leftist one, trying to fight for something that was at the center of their claims, is the ownership of land and the ownership of resources of the country. So this is very important to have in mind in order to see where the movement goes. So in the 50s and 60s, the support to this guerrilla from outside, from the Soviet Union, from the Cubans, from China, there were two different factions, the Moscow inclined, the China inclined. So it is a melting pot that is very, very interesting to see. Colombia, the difference of other Latin American countries, was not subject to long military regimes that were very strong and in many cases absolutely ruthless. We have, just in this process of adjustment of the two parties that I was mentioning you that were fighting each other, a very brief 3 years rule of a military that was prompted by the same civilians that say, we need something to make a buffer here, but very soon that military regime disappeared and the civil rule started, democratically speaking. So Colombia has been very democratic, was one of the ancient democracies in Latin America, and the rule of law have been the predominant issue in Colombia. So the guerrillas move on, takes part of the territory, the presence of the state is very weak, the possibilities of really have social and economic programs in those areas is very, very debilitated. And what happens is that little by little these fronts of guerrillas start to dominate some areas. And the different governments that from the 70s, 80s started to look at the problem and see how to be solved, tried many times to establish a dialogue with these guerrillas, to establish procedures to negotiate, but to no avail. And to no avail because they were not very well planned, they were not very well organized, there was not a methodological approach to the peace process. And so every time that it was tried, it was a failure. So when the government of President Santos arrived to office in 2010, having him been Minister of Defense and Minister of Finance before, with a good knowledge of the different problems and difficulties to get into a possibility of a dialogue, and having looked at the lessons of the past, not only the national one, but the international ones, then he decided to create a very specific plan to approach the negotiation, taking into account different experiences, international experiences, one of them the process of Northern Ireland, very close to you down here. And in that process, advisors, analysis of the situation, how the peace process was conducted here, were very much of use and illustration for conducting the process. So the first thing to do, and this is a fundamental issue in the peace process, is how to plan the dialogue, how to enter into the negotiation. Some of you will recall a very important antecedent, which is the Oslo agreements between the Israel and the OLP, the famous Arafat terrorist group of the time. And it was an impossible and irreconcilable situation. And the whole thing started with a secret dialogue with people that in principle were not politically representatives of the two parties, but they started to create some kind of trust, or at least to air the difficulties or the irreconcilable issues that existed between them. And it's later on, like 10 months or 1 year later, of this secret dialogue, that some terms of reference to negotiate emerged, and it was possible a political dialogue that ended up in the first peace agreement, if you can call that so, but it is very close to that, the Camp David agreement. So this experience of Oslo was something that inspired the president to say, first of all, we have a secret dialogue, and we won't go to the table of negotiations until we have a concrete agenda about what we're going to negotiate. Because in the past, one of the problems that we faced is that the guerrilla, with all their claims and all their grievances, say we need to restructure the state, we need to change the economic model, we need to change the institution. So that was absolutely unadmissible for the different governments. So the idea was, we are going to see what the issues are, what the problems to tackle are in the negotiations, and once we have this agenda, we will start to negotiate. And effectively, that was so in 2012, when the two parties agreed on an agenda with very specific and concrete issues to solve. The issue of the rural development and the land ownership, the issue of participation, future participation in politics of the actors of the guerrilla, the issue of the eradication of the illicit crops, and I will come back to this in a moment, and the center of the whole process is the rights and the reparation of the victims, in which the areas like the restitution of land play a very important role. This with a process of transitional justice that was necessary to see how to make this transition to the 50 years of illegality to full participation in politics. So this is the way the negotiation is established and the way the dialogue starts. And one of the most important approaches from the government was not to do this negotiation in an isolated way, but just to call upon the international community to be the witness of this dialogue, to surround the dialogue, and to help us to facilitate the conversations and the negotiations without an intervention or a mediation at the style of the United Nations system of mediations between countries. So that's why the Norwegians play a very important role in facilitating the start of the negotiation, and then the Cubans to be the hosts of what was going to be the dialogue that expanded for more than 4 years. Other countries, neighbor countries like Chile, like Venezuela, were witnesses of the negotiations, and then very soon we asked major actors of the international community, like the United States, the European community, to the Russians, the Chinese, to be aware of our process. I was at that time, as I was mentioned, at the United Nations, and I was sitting in the Security Council. So the President has the opportunity and the possibility to speak to all of the 5 permanent representatives, the head of the state of the 5 permanent representatives of the Security Council, all the other 10 members, and started to socialize the process. And that was fundamental because that was also a way to give guarantees to the FARC that this was going to be a process in which the eyes of the world were going to be the vigilant ones. And when we were close to the end of the negotiation, we did something that was very unexpected, is to go to the Security Council on a voluntary basis and to ask the Security Council to issue a resolution creating a tripartite commission with the representatives of the government of the FARC and the international component to be the monitors and of the ceasefire and the rendering of arms at a very important, and that was a very important part of the negotiation, in which the FARC were very clear and were very well informed that the guarantees that they were asking were going to be given by the United Nations. Coming back a little bit at what we were talking about, the development of the guerrilla, I will say that the issue of the coca plantation and the illicit drugs play a fundamental role in the survival of this guerrilla. You have seen, you have looked at these matters, that all the guerrilla movements in South America ended up in a dissolution or completely defeated by the governments, the military governments that were very strong. In Colombia, the FARC and the other movement, the ELN, that is a small one, still active but in full motion of negotiations with the government, they managed to survive because they use very productive tools like kidnappings and drug trafficking. Having it has been for the drug trafficking, the FARC would have disappeared 20 years ago. But that maintained the oxygen and gave them the necessary economic resources to continue to fight. And it was only like 10 years ago when we were, or a little bit more in 2010, yes, when we received the full support of the United States and the European Union with the plan that was called the Plan Colombia, that the army of Colombia managed to get some kind of resources to fight more effectively the guerrilla and to be more effective in the actions that were taking place there. This is a very important part because, as it was mentioned in Catalina's explanation about the way they have looked at the book and the narrative of this period, is that the armed forces and the establishment, the state in Colombia was very weak, and the possibility to really fight an insurrection was very, very difficult. So it was just only when there was some kind of muscle that it was possible to be more effective and to fight the rebellion. At the same time, the country went on another track of economic development. It's quite a paradox that having this guerrilla, bombing pipelines, kidnapping people, and extorting people here and there, fighting with paramilitaries, fighting with drug traffickers, there was a moment in which we have a panoply of forces that were impossible to deal with, in which the official armed forces were the weakest of them all. So in this panorama, during almost 5-10 years, we managed to get a little bit more control. And the economy of the country, Colombia is a country that is twice the size of France. We are talking about 1,200,000 square kilometers, with all kinds of climates and tropical jungles and plains, and it's a typical place in which to fight a guerrilla is a very difficult matter. And but with tremendous resources and capabilities to be developed, and the economy of Colombia grew for the last 10 or 15 years at an average of 4 to 5% a year. So in a way, the conflict was very much localized in the rural areas. In the cities and the industrial areas continued to flourish, continued to move on. In the last years, after the success of the government in fighting the guerrillas, the situation was much more positive in these areas. So there is here, you will see that the moment the negotiations with the FARC start is when the FARC are very weak and the conditions were there, and the government used this tool to say, you're very weak, this is not going to be a war up to the end to exterminate everybody. Let's start negotiating. And in a way, the strategy worked very well, and then finally this negotiation was able to be concluded 4 or 5 years. We are now, I'm not going to enter into the details about how the agreements were approved. There was a referendum in Colombia in which the opposition won the referendum against the peace process for a very, very small margin. It was a campaign similar to the Brexit that took place here, with a lot of lies and representations. Finally, the Congress of Colombia, after some adjustments to the agreements, passed the law, constitutional reforms. The courts of Colombia ratified the constitutionality of all the agreements, and we are now in this phase of the post-agreements, post-conflict, started to build the peace. We signed very important agreements to stop the war, to cease fire, to cease hostilities. Now we are in the process of building peace in Colombia. And here I have to say that we are encounter a very special situation that is typical of this peace process, is the reintegration and the reincorporation of the guerrillas to the civil and political life. So there are two components that for the society are very important. Is what kind of justice is going to be applied to these people that have committed this series of crimes? And on the other side, how we are going to guarantee that these people that were insurrections, rebels, are going to participate in politics. Because at the end, the objective and the purpose of the peace process is to stop these people using arms and to invite them to participate in the political life and ask for the votes of the people. And here is when you see the fractions of a society. People in society that said, we are ready to pardon them, we are ready to reconcile and to allow their participation, but we need a minimum of justice. And other people that said, we have the full weight of justice to the people and let's delay their participation in politics. So here are the two factions. And in the middle of that, a huge responsibility of the government, which is one of the main purposes of these agreements, is the rights of the victims. We are talking about 50 years of conflict, displaced people that were caught in the middle of the fire of guerrillas and paramilitaries and government. When you are talking about people that is waiting for some reparation, then you have to put that at the center of the negotiation. In general terms, and the victims were involved in the negotiation. They went to Havana, they faced the guerrillas, they were recognized by them. There is a psychological and sociological process that plays a very important role here, and that helps a lot to heal many of the wounds that have been inflicted during this conflict. But the people in the cities were much more impermeable to these kind of agreements, and that's why the opposition, there was a very right opposition, played this card, saying we cannot allow impunity, and everything that is proposed here is to guarantee the impunity of the guerrillas and things like that. So we are, for the government and the negotiators, the purpose was to get as much justice as possible that will allow the peace to take place. What is the justice you are going to apply? You will go to jail. No guerrilla is going to sign a peace agreement to say, where is the door of my jail to be secluded there for 10 years. So then there is what to do. You need to create a transitional justice. And that was a very important part of the agreement. The creation of the Special Justice for Peace Tribunal with 50 magistrates that have been already appointed. The rules of operation of that tribunal are still today being discussed in Congress in Colombia. And there are, of course, the fight between the different, the opposition and the government to give this tribunal the specific mandates to be for the opposition as strong as possible, as hard as possible with the guerrillas. And we have a very, I will say, unhappy coincidence, is that we are about to have elections in 4 months. In March, we will be electing the Congress. In May, a new president. So the circumstance we have at the moment is to have a tribunal that is about to be created, elections that are open, and these guerrilla people that are supposed to go to trial are at the same time inscribing their names as candidates, even a presidential candidate. Remember, they are going to have, by right and as part of the negotiation, 5 places in the Senate and 5 places in the House of Representatives. So the big directors of the guerrilla are now candidates to go to the Senate, to the House of Representatives, and even to be a candidate to the presidency. So that has created a very serious reaction in the country, and we need, as a matter of urgency, that this tribunal could be constituted and this could start procedures, because we will see a circumstance in which we will have the guerrilla chiefs being judged in the morning and in Congress in the afternoon, and maybe some of them condemned, many of them already have been condemned in absence about very important crimes. And we have, on top of that, the International Court of the Rome Status, the Statuto de Roma, in which they are ready to see how our institutions work but in case of it, they don't work properly, there are crimes against humanity in which this International Court of Justice will say that they will take the cases as part of their mandate. And Colombia is one of the founder members of the International Court of Justice. So, in the middle of all this debate, the political debate, we are in the process of implementing the agreements in very important areas like all the rural programs, all the investment of the monies in projects. We have the assistance of the international community that is very important. All the process of restitution of land, reparation of victims, strengthening the action of the state in the different regions, because what we intend with this peace process is to give the peace a kind of territorial dimension, that the presence of the state, the presence of the services, the health, the education, the infrastructural development could reach those areas that were not touched before by the action of the state. So if you want to make a kind of big summary about what is a peace process about, is one about rights, is the rights of the victims, is the rights of reparation, and is also those who have signed the peace agreements, the right to be reintegrated to the political life. And on the other side is the territorial peace, is the big effort of the state to really provide the necessary services and the necessary assistance for the well-being of the population. Colombia, we are talking about 50 million of people. So the challenges are enormous. We, as I said, we have had a very important sympathy, assistance and support by the international community. Very important infrastructural development is taking place in order to communicate the country in a better way, not only with big motorways, but also with all the communication roads that are necessary to get to places. You will think about something that is very important, is that the resistance and the reluctance for many people in the countryside, in the rural area that have been involved in the coca plantation, protected or completely dominated by the guerrillas, both of them. Now there are some dissidents of the guerrillas that they don't want to abandon the coca plantations. So a very sui generis situation is being created, is that the program of eradication that the government is conducted and substitution of these illicit crops is encountering tremendous opposition in the field by those poor peasants that have been doing the coca plantations, and so the program of guaranteeing them that they are going to be remunerated with the new crops, with the new production is something that is there, but it takes time. So there have been already some kind of encounters between the police and those the coca planters that don't want to get out of there, and there are some former guerrillas that are protecting them. We have a plan to eradicate 50,000 hectares of coca this year and another 50 next year. You can imagine Colombia never was, by tradition, a coca producer country. It was more in the south, in Peru and Bolivia and Ecuador, because it is a product that was more for the indigenous tradition of these countries, and it was a product that was used to keep the people working all day, chewing the coca. The cocaine came later, and when the cocaine trade started, the cartels of Colombia decided to eliminate the providers in Peru and Ecuador, and then transfer and created the plantations in Colombia. And we came from producing 5% of the coca of the world 50 years ago to produce today 90% of the world coca production. So this is, as you can imagine, a very big challenge, and we are working on that. But the thing to reflect about is that Colombia managed to end 50 years of conflict, that in the last year and a half or so, the military hospital is completely deserted. that no soldiers, no guerrillas have been killed in the last 3 years almost, and that the country is starting to build a peace. The process of reconciliation and the process of understanding of the different factions is a very, very slow one, but we will do as we did in the peace process. We will persevere, we will be very resilient on this, and we will continue to try to get our country in full peace. So these are more or less some of the reflections I wanted to bring with you, and I am available for questions and exchange of views. Thank you very much.
I'm going to keep this fairly brief because although I'm billed as an expert speaker, my expertise does not lie in the field of Colombian politics or the conflict or the peace process there. But what I can maybe add comments on and maybe raise questions about is in relation to peace processes in general and accompanying transitional justice processes in general. I want to thank the two speakers today because you've given me a lot of food for thought as well, particularly in terms of the intricacy of getting people to the table in the first place to actually forge that peace process, and also reflecting on the fact that the striving for peace was something that existed for many years prior, and it was a trial and error process. But I think it's illuminating to know that the political will, the will for peace, is something that existed for a long duration during that conflict. Now, in terms of peace processes and transitional justice, one of the questions that I guess I have about peace processes in general is what the aims are and what the time duration is as well, because I guess you could look at two ends of the spectrum. At one end of the spectrum, you could say that the aim of a peace process is to bring about an end to violence, a cessation of violence. And at the other end of the spectrum, what you're aiming to do is to bring about a transformation of the relations of power in order to remove, systems of oppression, systems of exploitation, and to forge a more equitable society. That means, I guess, if you aim for a cessation of violence in a peace process, you're setting the bar very low, and you're also setting yourself up for the possibility of a resurgence of violence somewhere down the line. If you aim for a complete transformation of society, then there's a possibility that you're raising the bar so high that one could never attain it. And when you look at any peaceful and stable society around the world, that kind of transformation is most definitely a work in progress. But if we look at peace processes that have gone on in the last 20 years or so, and transitional justice processes, I think there's a few things we can learn, but I think it also drives home just how complex I think the Colombian peace process and the transitional justice process in Colombia is and will continue to be. If you look at South Africa, for example, their peace process focused mainly on bringing out the truth of the violations of human rights that occurred, and to some extent bringing about a limited sort of amount of prosecution. But for the most part, there was immunity for those who actually came and told their stories. And the aim of that was to actually bring about reconciliation. In Northern Ireland, in the peace process there, what we see is a government of national unity and I guess forging a new phase of political inclusion and political participation amongst different parties to the conflict. Now in South Africa, you saw the end of apartheid, you saw the beginning of open democracy and an inclusive political system, but what we still see are those entrenched differences. South Africa remains one of the most unequal countries in the world. The gap between rich and poor is probably highest there than it is higher there than it is anywhere else, and that gap still has a very strong ethnic dimension to it. In Northern Ireland, we see the Government of National Unity, I guess, going through a period of stasis at the moment. There was a breakdown of self-governance. Stormont is currently not functioning, and also you just have to walk down the street, walk down Shankill Road or Falls Road, and view the ongoing so-called peace war between them, and talk to people on the street to realise that there is a long way to go to reconcile these tensions that accompanied the conflict there. Now, how does one go about reconciling the complexity of violence and that sort of really complex relationship between victims and perpetrators in a civil war in Colombia that lasted for 52 years? A civil war where those original grievances based on inequalities and land distribution became so complexified during the conflict that you have a whole distinct set of grievances that accumulated since 1964 around land redistribution, so much so that addressing those original grievances and addressing those accumulated grievances during the conflict requires almost very different transitional justice processes. And then, of course, in Catalina's presentation, one of the things that I pulled out of that was, I guess, how important are the stories we tell ourselves in terms of that peace process and in terms of the transitional justice process around land redistribution. And of course, the stories we tell ourselves then feed into the extent to which these processes gain popular legitimacy. And that's really key. And with an election coming up in Colombia in the coming months, I think we will get a gauge or a sense of just how much people buy into that process, and hopefully there will be a continued ownership of that. But of course, last year's referendum result shows just how, I guess, contested things are going forward. So I guess in terms of that, looking at, I guess, processes of transitional justice and some of the outcomes one would like to achieve in such processes, in relation to Colombia, I suppose I have two questions. And that is, first of all, in relation to land redistribution, which is one of the key components of transitional justice, how does Law 1448 address, I guess, these different dimensions of grievances in relation to land redistribution? I'd be curious to know about that, just to maybe kick off a Q&A session. But also, in terms of I suppose the slow-moving nature of any peace process and any accompanying transitional justice process, what kind of time frame, if any, is envisaged for the peace process in Colombia, and is there an envisaged endpoint at all? And I might leave it at that. Thank you very much for the two speakers. For me, it was enormously illuminating, and it's a privilege to add a little bit at the end, and I look forward to having some further discussions about it. Thank you very much.